Today I want to try to get through a lot, and since it's the end of something, and I always have so much to say, and to the point of like being a cartoon character, how I feel sometimes, and so I go a little bit faster, and unless I say something that out of ignorance or failure of attention is in conflict with the Dharma, let me run on for the time. And then you can send your questions to me at my email address, which is guy.newland@cmich.edu, or you can talk to me as I'll still be around here today. And then what we're going to do is try to talk about dependent arising a little bit as the root of all reasonings, as all the other reasonings for why things are empty. And so we'll talk about that for a little while, and then we're going to look at the question that relates to the treatise verses 15:1-2, and the question of, do things have a nature in this system? It's a somewhat difficult topic. And then we'll, after discussing that, then we'll do some like quicker treatments of like just one verse on going and a few comments on change. And if there's still time, a few comments on person, and then wrap it up. So as you see, I have a lot set out for me to do. So start right away. When you make, I don't know about how it is when if you're a mother and you have a baby, whether you think I made that thing, or whether you become aware of this, causes and conditions in an acute way. And I was thinking about it. It's like, well, if one's pregnant with a baby and then one has a baby, that like all of the processes are like unconscious, even though you have to do things. So it's sort of more like, where did that come from? More like that. But it's like when you make what I do know is about what it's like when you make a book. And and when you get to the point of like having the book like almost ready to be published, there's this weird kind of like mind that you sort of don't expect, because people think that you wrote the book. And well, especially, people think, there's a real book and it has Guy's name on it, and Guy made that book. But then when you're at the point of being the person who's like getting ready to send the book off to be published, you have this, everybody, I think everybody, whether they're Buddhist or not, at least, gets some moment. And if you're Buddhist, it's like inevitable and acute that people who are Buddhists and finish writing books always are thinking like, ooh, gosh, it's sort of like nominally true that I made this book, but there's like so many causes and conditions that were indispensable for it to exist, that where would I begin thanking people? It would be like infinite. And it's like, you get this, I was teasing Snow Lion, it was send them in a book that consisted of an endless acknowledgement, and never actually got to the part that was after the acknowledgement, because there's always more people that you can be grateful to, and who are actually in some way indispensable, right, in one way or another. And so anyway, then this has become more like a cliche at the beginning of books, written by Western Buddhists to talk about dependent arising in the acknowledgement section. And some people are threatening to do a history of dependent arising on the basis of acknowledgement sections of Buddhist books. And so just like without doing formal study, who is it that people feel like to thank in the acknowledgement sections, and to recognize that this isn't something that I autonomously had the power to do? And it's like, well, they thank their teachers. Right, and they always thank their teachers, and they thank their colleagues, and they usually thank somebody who's helped them make it into a book at the publishing house, and they thank their colleagues, right? And then of course, then there's many of their spouses or partners, and then there gets to be then a long list of various people that they've learned something, and people have to like decide where to draw the line, and it always gets very difficult. And one of the things that's interesting is that, and I was thinking about this, that the most common thing and the thing that people emphasize the most is thanking their teachers. And So some of the ways that people thank their teachers, one could get the impression that they didn't make the book, their teacher really made the book. And they were just like, you know, a limb of their teacher's blessing, whereby the book came into being. And then if you go to sort of an extreme like that, you can almost begin to feel that, like, well, I don't inherently exist, but there's clearly some real source of this book, so it must be the teacher. You know, that the teacher's dependent arising is not recognized necessarily as much as you recognize your own dependent arising and the dependent arising of the book at that moment. And so there's this sense that, well, there's one real thing in the world, and that's my teacher. I don't know about me. I'm not sure. I know this book is very sketchy in terms of its ontological status, but somehow it's appearing because of the blessing of my teacher. And so people have that sense at that point. And related to that, you know, in the verse that we read about the Tathagata as an example of the person, which is treatise 22.1, neither the aggregates nor different from the aggregates. The aggregates are not in him, nor he is in the aggregates. The Tathagata does not possess the aggregates. What is the Tathagata? Well, in the very beginning of 22.1, Nagarjuna takes the Buddha, the person of the Buddha, the Tathagata, as the thing that he's going to use to demonstrate unfindability. He doesn't posit. There's one thing that's real that I know for sure that exists in and of itself, and that's the Tathagata, but he just fearlessly goes on with the idea that, look, if anything works or has any meaning or existence, it has to be empty of inherent existence, and of course that would include the Tathagata, so he's next in the lineup here of things to be. He gets chapter 22, you know, sort of slotted in there. And I just think that I don't know, there's a potential, like, oh, what Jeffrey wrote about this, he said, well, when people are doing the analysis of how things exist, that there's some Tibetans who said that, like, when you're taking something to be analyzed, it's not suitable to take your teacher. And then, of course, this would include ultimately the teacher, and that would, in fact, contradict, you know, what Nagarjuna himself did, where, you know, he actually took the teacher. And you know, Jeffrey and his reporting his teachers of saying, no, it's most suitable, like, to take Buddha as a thing to analyze. It's not inherently existing. And I don't know, I just mentioned this in part because I think sometimes when we are in the mode of letting go of worldly attachments, that then there can be a sneaky way in which we then become attached to other sort of different specific kind of Buddhism-related things, in the case of Tibetan Buddhism, the teacher being high on the list, and it is and because all you know, Tibetans and so forth were, like, subject to conceptions of inherent existence and had great respect for their teachers, it seems pretty natural that that would become sometime an issue. And so anyway, that's like in Zen, of course, this idea of cutting the other way, and it's like within the context of everybody focusing on religion-related things, like, say, being a good meditator, or the Buddha, or the Dharma, or the scriptures being the thing that we're now saying, here's the one real thing, that those things then become subject to analysis and deconstruction. Yeah. In any case, the idea is that there isn't anything that, you know, it's not just that these certain thing, like this book, doesn't inherently exist, but then there must be some, we're sort of like, then look, you know, don't keep going with our analysis and just say, oh yeah, it's so amazing this book came to be, and here's the list of the causes and conditions, and the teacher is so powerful that kind of like accounts for how the book was here. But you never get to the bottom of it. That's the point. There's no bottom of it. There's no beginning to the complexity and the beginninglessness of dependent arising. It doesn't mean that everything is equally causing everything. Not everything is a cause of everything, obviously. But there's, like, you know, you can trace back an infinite number of causes and conditions that are part of the process for any particular thing appearing at a certain place in time. And you can't, you know, we have to stop in the acknowledgement section, but in your mind you have to understand that there isn't any place to stop, and that's the whole point. It's not just to go back a little way and then stop. And that relates to this idea of reifying dependent arising itself. And that's what the Nagarjuna is criticizing the Buddhist realists are, because all these people that he's attacking in the Treatise on the Middle Way also believe in dependent arising. But they believe in the dependent arising where the causes have some reality of their own. Right? Thich Nhat Hanh talked about that in terms of how saying, there's a cloud in this piece of paper, and then going on with every other thing that you could possibly think of, the bread that was eaten by the logger's grandmother, and so forth, that if the logger's grandmother didn't get enough nutrition, then there wouldn't have been a logger, then there wouldn't, and so it's like you get so many things that, who harvested the bread that was, where do the nutrients for the soil that grew the bread that the logger's grandmother ate, and so forth. It's like, well, if the soil had been poor, the harvest was bad, she'd starve to death, then there wouldn't have been a logger, and then it was like so many things that, and it's like you don't come to the back of it or the bottom of it in that way. And Thich Nhat Hanh sort of shows us that it's not just, okay, a seed produces a sprout. It's like it's endlessly, it's beginningless, and so complexly interrelated even in a single moment. There's a substantial cause in the prior moment, but there's so many other causes and conditions that have to be present. Like for me to be talking right now, there's a substantial cause of my prior, moment, but, it also depends on the sun not exploding, and so, and well, really, that's really important, right? And then like a whole bunch of other things that have to come together, right? Yeah, so His Holiness, and that uses, thinks along those lines when he teaches at Lehigh the idea that, in Buddhism, the core thing is that we believe in causation, and when we trace this back, this leads us to conclude that there can't be any uncaused cause. There can't be any divine creator, because everything is caused, right? He's teaching that you have to think, not stop, and think of dependent arising just as something that is like has a finite quality. And Nagarjuna teaches dependent arising in sort of a abbreviated way in the Ratnavali that we were looking at, and in the large handout on the bottom of page 53, he verses 48 and 49 in the Precious Garland, he says, "When this is, that arises, like short when there is long." That's an example that he doesn't use as far as I remember in the treatise. Due to the production of this, that is produced, like light from the production of flame. So as soon as there's long, then there's short. We can understand in it, when he's talking to a king, it's a really clear example of how, yeah, there are short things and long things. There are tall things and high things, like mountains, and low things, and like, ocean bottoms or valleys, but they don't have some sort of naturally existent highness or lowness or tallness or shortness. And this is just clearly like posited in a relative or relational way. And since that's easy to understand, he's saying, well, it's just like that how things are produced. They don't have any like natural way of being a sprout, but just in so far as like one thing depends on the other in case of high and low and long and short, it's just like that's why there's light. There's no light that's like naturally existent. It like completely depends in order to be light on something else, okay? Which is a little bit less obvious than maybe the long and the short, which you can see even in a single moment as like needing each other to be relatively existent. And then he sort of turns it around and looks at it the other way on top of page 54. When there is long, there is short, and then spells out what he's intending to refute, right? It's not that therefore these things don't exist. They do exist. There is long and there is short, but they don't exist by their own nature. They've propped each other up. This sort of bottomless propping up of things by other things is, this another way to think about this. And I don't know. I guess that's why Bob Thurman went to calling it relativity. Of course, that has its complications too, but that's the idea, is nothing exists just in and of itself, but it's only this sort of endless matrix of relationality that makes it possible for things. So when there is light, it's due to causes, and when light does not arise, it's due to the failure of those causes to come together. And it's the same thing with a Dharma light as it is with a visible light. It depends upon causes and conditions. Like there's a sense in which the Dharma can never go away, right? And the profound truths aren't changed, but in terms of their accessibility in the world, it depends upon causes and conditions, and is not just like naturally existent. Okay, so I wanted to just, in the last saying a little bit more about dependent arising, point out something, because we were talking about how this reasoning of dependent arising relates to other reasonings where you're, say, refuting the idea that a sprout is produced because it's not produced from something that's the same or essentially different or both or neither, right? We were going over that reason before. And how do these reasonings relate to each other? And there's a lot in actually emptiness yoga that relates to this. And I just thought I'd just read one little passage. A realization of emptiness induces ascertainment of dependent arising. But that doesn't mean that a consciousness that's realizing emptiness either explicitly or even implicitly understands dependent arising at that time, unless, of course, you're a Buddha. Because emptiness is a sheer negation, and dependent arising is not. I made that point before. Nevertheless, understanding emptiness assists in understanding dependent arising, because emptiness means a lack of independence, and therefore has the import of dependence. So, and then this is his just sort of advice about how to relate this kind of meditation and how things are not produced from self, other, both, and neither, and how to relate that to meditation on how things are empty because they're dependently imputed to their basis of designation. When meditating on production, every now and then switch over to the dependent imputation and realize that things are imputed in dependence on their parts, and that they are not the collection of the parts, and they are not the parts individually, and so forth. Then see if you have the same sense of no inherent existence that you had when you were reflecting on their production, and try to bring these two together so that the reasoning of production becomes just as strong as the reasoning of dependent imputation. What he's assuming there is that when we start out, it will be a little easier to get a feeling from meditating on dependent arising, but then turn to these meditations on refuting the ideas that things could be produced inherently because they're not produced from themselves or from something that's inherently different or both or neither. And work with that reasoning, getting into it farther and farther, and then periodically checking how well you're doing on that one versus what your sense is when you go back to thinking of dependent arising. Anyway, I just thought I'd share that because that was page 342 to 343. Okay, so that was pretty good. Okay, so number 2. What I'm going to do now is, in effect, a commentary on the Treatise on the Middle Way, verses chapter 15, verses 1 to 2. And you have these verses as translated by Geshe Ngawang Gyatso, what's his name? Ngawang Samden and Jay Garfield on your one-page handout. It's the one that says page 315 at the bottom, and then over to the next page it says page 317. So those you should number in the margin like 15.1 and then 15.2. That's what those verses are in the treatise. Okay, so before we read them, let me just introduce this and then we'll come back and read them. The point of this, as I said, is to answer the question in terms of the system, not 5 different systems at once. do things have a nature? And to do it via the system, by which I mean, what does Tsongkhapa say about this, and what does Chandrakirti say about this, in terms of how they interpret Nagarjuna? Well, just to avoid, let's set quickly, to avoid some confusion, let's remember that in the system there are two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth, that they both exist, which means that they both exist conventionally. Ultimate truth exists conventionally, conventional truth exists conventionally, because nothing exists ultimately, and that they are always exactly right together in a single entity, that they're split apart by the mind as it thinks about what this is and what that is, but they're always in space or time, they're always co-located as part of a single entity. Okay, okay, so that's the basic thing to keep in mind. Now, two wrong positions that are just very interesting to juxtapose to each other. First, regard these two truths. Some people, in effect, without necessarily explicitly saying it, say things that add up to meaning that the ultimate truth really exists, and because the ultimate truth really exists or absolutely exists, this empties out conventional truth, conventional existing things of any actual existence at all. They are false appearances that don't have any legitimate conventional existence. And so, in a sense, they will still say there's two truths, but they don't acknowledge any sort of convention, say, Panyademba or Vyavahara Satya, any transactional legitimacy to the conventional side. There's just these false appearances because everything that exists actually is this one real, absolutely real truth. Okay, so that would be Dolpapa, Sherab Gyaltsen, and the wrong, as His Holiness calls it, the wrong kind of other emptiness view or Shendong view. Not saying that everybody who says that they're other emptiness has that view, but if you reify ultimate reality and say that it essentially exists, then you hollow out the other truth and you undermine the idea that there are two truths. Okay, so that's one wrong view. Obviously, Tsongkhapa and Chandrakirti want to avoid that. The other wrong view, or, well, the other view, we'll say what it is first, and you can think about whether it's wrong or not, is that there are people now who say that the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth. And one can also say that by saying, same thing, that the nature of things is that there is no nature of things. And this is an advocated position by people who have read this Nagarjuna and so forth, and are Buddhists in some cases, and very knowledgeable about this material, and they read this material and reach this conclusion. And what they mean by this, or at least some of them, is not that, like, gosh, Buddhism is all about paradox and contradiction and mystification, and because it's so contradictory, it must be deeper than any, they don't, actually there used to be people who said that, there probably still are, but that's not what these people mean. It means something very different from that. They say normally when something is contradictory, then we can set it aside as false. But some contradictions are true because they are pointing at the very limits of what we can think or conceive. And that there is some small category of contradictions that one can call true contradictions. And that there are a few of these that you can name in Buddhism, and one of these are sort of two ways of pointing to a true contradiction, that the nature of things is that there is no nature of things. Okay, so that's a view. You can think about that. Now, in thinking about it, some people, I'm not saying everybody who holds that view, but some people, in thinking about what that means, will say that this sort of implies that, in a sense, the ultimate truth basically cancels itself out. That ultimate truth is that there's no ultimate truth. So let's set that aside and talk about what we really have. And what we really have is conventional truth. So instead of saying there's only one truth and it's ultimate truth, the conventionals doesn't exist, but people just talk about it, then these people have the opposite, which is that what exists is conventional things, but when we try to talk about how they are, we end up talking about this ultimate truth, which doesn't make sense because the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth, but that just gives us a way to think about how these actual things that do exist are. And so in one way of understanding this is that there's only conventional truth when you come down to it, because when you talk about ultimate truth, you end up having to say that the ultimate truth is that there's no ultimate truth. Okay? So the one people is going to say there's really only ultimate truth, and the other people can say, well, there's really only conventional truth. Okay. So we are now going to see how this might relate to Tsongkhapa's position on 15.1 and 2, and maybe this is the time to just read those over. Essence, and that would be their translation of svabhava, so could be nature or own being, arising from causes and conditions, makes no sense. Essence arisen from causes and conditions would be created, and therefore that would be contradictory to its being a nature or an essence or an own being. Okay, of course, this whole thing is about what does that word mean. So if you don't know what the word means, you're in good. That's a whole question. It's what do they mean? What does this mean when he says this word svabhava? I mean, they decided to go with essence here, but everybody, intrinsic nature, intrinsic existence, own being. I mean, it's like, that's the question. What are they talking about when they say svabhava? Okay. And then the next verse says, how could it be appropriate to call that which is created essence? It's pretty clear that that's a rhetorical question by Nagarjuna that follows directly from the previous 4 lines. Okay. Then, the crux of the matter is the next 2 lines. Essence itself is not constructed. Sometimes that word could be translated fabricated. It's not made. It's not constructed or fabricated, and does not depend on another. Okay? So, for future reference, like just I'll put this, so this will be in the recording. This is a difficult topic, and the things to read on it are Introduction to Emptiness, page 61 to 64 as a starting place. And then for the original sources, you want to read The Great Treatise, volume 3, page 197 to 200, and The Ocean of Reasoning, page 318 to 320. And for a full treatment of the problem of this verse from a Gelugpa point of view, there's Bill McGee's The Nature of Things. Okay, so in thinking about how Tsongkhapa interprets this verse, we should remember that Tsongkhapa went through, according to his life story, it could be that it was a display, but anyway, according to his life story, and according to things that he wrote, he went through great difficulties and trials. He was sorely tested in working out the view. He didn't just like sit at his teacher's feet. His teacher was Rendao, right? And is like, oh, now I got it. It wasn't anything like that. He had great difficulties working out the view. And ultimately, Manjushri became his instructor. And Manjushri told him a number of things you might know. But one of the things he told him was to rely upon Chandrakirti, because how could one like that have error? So Tsongkhapa is in a position where he has to be guided by Chandrakirti, and he many times praises Chandrakirti for helping him to understand what was going on in Nagarjuna. That's important because in reading these last 2 lines of 15.2, nature is not constructed and does not depend on another. Chandrakirti asked the question in his commentary, do things, in fact, have a nature that's not constructed and not dependent on another? And he very, very clearly says, yes, things do have such a nature that's not constructed and does not depend on another, and that nature is emptiness. Now, the reason that's a little bit difficult is because in the context, and according to how other commentators read it, it might seem that he's talking about the object of refutation. That's why Jay has it translated as essence, He's thinking of it as an essentially intrinsically existent thing. But there's no confusing that this is Chandrakirti's position. Things have a nature. Sprouts, eyes, tables, things have a nature that is not constructed and does not depend on another. Why? Because they have a fundamental reality of emptiness. Okay? So that sounds like it's saying that emptiness intrinsically exists, and then you're back over to the Dolbapa position. Okay? So maybe we should start in this regard by letting Chandrakirti speak. Bookmarks. Oh yeah. So let's see what Chandrakirti actually says. This is Great Treatise, Volume 3, page 198. Is there a nature that has the qualifications that Nagarjuna claims? And yes, and it is the reality that the Bhagavan spoke of extensively, saying whether the Buddhas appear or not, the reality of phenomena is the same. And what is this reality? It's the nature of things, such as these eyes here, or tables and chairs and so forth. Well, what is their nature? It is that in them which is neither fabricated nor dependent on something else. It's their identity as known by knowledge free from the impairment of ignorance. Free from the impairment of ignorance, we see what they are. Well, does this identity or reality or nature that doesn't depend on another and is unfabricated, does this identity exist or not? Chandrakirti asked the question to himself, and he says, if it didn't exist, why would bodhisattvas cultivate the path of their perfections? And why would bodhisattvas undergo hundreds of hardships in order to know reality? He says, then goes on to say, the final nature that is being referred to here is the unfabricated fundamental entity, which is inexorably or ineluctably, inescapably present. And it is not the later occurrence of something that was not there before. So in that sense, it doesn't depend on another because it doesn't depend on causes and conditions. We could say that it neither has, when we speak of something like fire, we say, does fire have such a nature or not? Well, it neither has it essentially nor lacks it essentially. But so therefore we say it has such a nature conventionally. So there is an ultimate truth. It is emptiness. It does exist conventionally. It doesn't cancel itself out in self-contradiction or paradox. And it is the reality for which makes it possible for us to practice the path, through knowing which we are able to practice the path and get out of cyclic existence. And that doesn't mean that it exists in and of itself. But why it sounds like it exists in and of itself, because you just say it doesn't depend on another, and it's unfabricated. So you have to understand what he means by that. What does Tsongkhapa say? No, Tsongkhapa has to now comment on Chandrakirti, who Manjushri told him couldn't make a mistake, so he couldn't leave out that. And like other commentators on Nagarjuna don't say this. This is Chandrakirti's distinct thing. Yeah. First, he says, if we look at these two verses, this is at the page 195, the first thing Tsongkhapa says, if we ask whether a sprout, for example, has some sort of svabhava, intrinsic nature, in general, we would say, we will refute this. No, it doesn't, right? However, and then he says, incidentally, the hlopur, or in a particular case, right? In this situation, we have to understand that fabricated means produced in the sense of a new occurrence of something that didn't exist before. And to depend upon something else, depend upon another, doesn't mean that just any kind of general interrelationality. It means specifically depending on causes and conditions in order to come into existence. You follow? So in case of emptiness, things can never not be empty, right? Because because emptiness is the lack of something that's impossible to ever exist. And so it can't be fabricated, and things just started being empty at the time of Buddha or right before Buddha or something like that. It doesn't make any sense. So it's not made, and doesn't just newly come about through causes and conditions. It does, in some sense, depend on something else, because everything exists only interrelationally. But this is, in this context, actually, and if you do read it in the most charitable light, in light of what Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa say, you can see, well, this is what he's talking about, is dependent arising in terms of causes and conditions, right? And in that kind of dependent arising, it doesn't apply to emptiness in that way, because emptiness is not a momentary phenomenon, not something that's produced by certain causes, like we were talking about the other day a little bit. So then, these comments are on page 199 of volume 3. Tsongkhapa says, Chandrakirti says that to attain nirvana means to perceive nirvana. And he says that nirvana is a true cessation, and that true cessations are ultimate truths. And that if there were no nature, then there were no, say, fundamental nature. If there were no nature that was primordially the way that things exist, then ultimate truths wouldn't exist, and the bodhisattva path wouldn't exist, and there wouldn't be any way for us to get awakened, right? And so he says, accordingly, compounded phenomena such as eyes are not natures, either in the sense of being essentially existent natures, nor are they natures in this different sense, when we ask what's posited as the final reality of things. So he makes it very clear that there's two senses of the word nature. One is which he's going to take as the main sense, and that's the bad sense, intrinsically existent. And then also acknowledge that the word nature is used in this other sense as referring to the fundamental basic mode of abiding of things, which is in a sense the actual direct opposite of the other word. But they're using the same word is used, and in this case Chandrakirti glosses it as having the good meaning of ultimate reality. So in the case of like an eye or a table or something like, they use the example eye. In case of an eye, it's neither sort of nature. It's not an emptiness, and it's not an intrinsically existent nature. It's neither one, right? Ultimate truths, on the other hand, are natures when we talk about reality being posited as the final nature of things, right? And you can't posit anything as the bad type of nature, because that's the thing that doesn't exist at all, and we mistakenly conceive. So it's extremely clear from this paragraph on page 199 of volume 3 that Tsongkhapa interprets Chandrakirti just by basically saying, look, the word nature can be more than one thing. Is that some big shock to scholars that words can be used to mean more than one thing? And you have to understand what usually he's using svabhava to mean the object of refutation, but the term can also refer to a basic nature or fundamental reality that doesn't exist in and of itself, but does exist as the thing that we want to realize, or as another synonym for emptiness, in other words, right? And because I think Tsongkhapa is very tuned into the fact that this word nature in Tibetan rangshin, right, can be used in both of these senses, that throughout the great treatise, he, in a way that you can't really tell, my fault really, from reading the English, he kind of distinguishes, when he's, what we're translating in here is intrinsic nature. It's not just rangshin, which could be nature. The intrinsic I've collapsed the whole phrase into that maybe more than I should have. And it really means it's ranging or trube rangshin. So it means he says the thing that we're refuting is a nature that exists by way of its own entity. And that phrase, which is very long, and it's in the middle of very, very, very long sentences, and is repeated over and over again, is his way of saying, look, when we say nature, you have to remember what kind of a nature we're talking about. Things do have a nature in a certain sense because things are empty, but they're empty because they lack a nature that exists is self-existent. They lack a self-existent nature. They lack a nature that's able to, a self-instituting nature. And that's what we, usually when we say things, are empty of inherent existence, empty of natural existence, we don't mean they're empty of emptiness. We mean they're, they're empty of some ability to set themselves up by some power that's built into them, right? So that has caused people some significant confusion. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, let's look now at going. On the small handout, the one-page handout, this refers to the one that says page 103 on the front, and you should write next to that 2.1. That's the first verse of the second chapter of the treatise on the middle way. And then also, if you can have open the larger handout to page 54, where Jeffrey discusses the refutation of motion and rest. Now, Jeffrey has actually a very long discussion of this, which we don't have time to go through, and I'm just going to summarize for you. But unfortunately, he doesn't actually quote here and give his translation of this 2.1. He gives his translations of some other verses. So I'm going to look at 2.1 first, because that's really as with a lot of these chapters, the meaning of the argument for each chapter sort of is important to read the first verse. Now Jay and Geshe Wang Samden did now where one has gone, one does not go. Where one has not yet gone, one does not go. Apart from where one has gone and where one has not gone, that over which one goes cannot be conceived. That's clear. Are we done? Now that in Sanskrit is gatam na gamyate tavad agatam naiva gamyate gata gata vinir muktam gamyamanam na gamyate. And so it's interesting verse in that, like, Nagarjuna manages to only use one verb, gam, to go, and to construct the whole stanza. And that's why it sounds so interesting in English. And that people have different translations of it, which quite different, but not necessarily wrong, because there's different ways of understanding, like, how to interpret what is meant by gatam and so forth. But just if I did it off my top of my head, I would say gatam nagamyate. The gone over is not being gone over. What has been gone over is not being gone over. Naiva agatam naiva gamyate. What is not gone over is also not being gone over. Apart from the gone over and the not gone over, maybe you got gone over, not gone over. Apart from the gone over and the not gone over, there isn't any being gone over to be gone over. Okay? That's why I understand it, right? I think in my mind it's very clear. It's like I try not to have questions. Is it short? Yes?
There's a poster school,
yeah.
And it says there's a fork on the path.
Yeah.
And the one side it says your life,
Uh-huh.
and the other side says no longer an option.
Uh-huh. I see.
And I think
That's how you're reading it?
The way you're going and the way you're not going.
Uh-huh.
The dividing point where your path is set in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
The path that you didn't take is no longer an option for you, because you're going single-pointedly somewhere else.
I don't think that's what it means, but maybe I'm not hearing. Maybe I have to study the poster more. But I'll tell you what this means, as I understand it, and then we can. You might be able to figure out whether it's the same as the poster. Okay, we was trying to say like, well, we think that obviously going must be something real. We're feeling that, and so then if it's real, there must be something that we're going over. But there's what's already been the part of the road or the path or the way in time that we've gone over, and the part that hasn't been gone over. And it's like the part that's already been gone over, we're obviously not going over that because that's already in the past. And the part that's not yet gone over, it's obvious that we're not going over that because you haven't come to it yet. So as just this one verse reads, setting aside the rest of the chapter, which Jeffrey gets into, but if just this one verse reads, it's using the law of the excluded middle, and it's saying, look, there's what's gone over and there's what's not gone over. It's like, and what else do you have? You know, that should like one and not one. That should encompass the possibilities. And yet, you can't actually be going over something that you've already finished going over, nor can you go over something that you haven't yet come to. So you're caught between the law of the excluded middle to say, like, well, where do we actually find this present moment or this present little piece of path? And I think that that's what Jeffrey was talking about, you know, with his memory of himself with the bicycle, of like trying to say, like, well, where is that moment, you know, where the present going is actually taking place. But, you know, so the first verse, to me, that's how I understand this, is that it's used, as Nagarjuna uses many times in the treatise, use the law of the excluded middle. You've got these two possibilities, A and not A, and if something really exists, then we should be able to, like, pin it down in one of these two things as really being this or really being that. And we can't find going as being something that's taking place on the part of the path we've already come to, nor on the part of the path we haven't yet come to. And you think, well, what about the part of the path you're on right now? Well, my first thought is, well, first of all, being able to find such a part of the path in between the law of the excluded middle is like, as the way that sets that up, it's like the gone over and the not yet gone over. It seems like impossible. But then, so that's one way of thinking that appears strongly to my mind. Like, as I mentioned, it was the other day, like thinking of like this nanosecond, this nanosecond, that nanosecond, and I'm like, okay, well, where are these nanoseconds? Like, there's the beginning, middle, end of them, and so forth, and it's like I have this sort of low degree of confidence in the present as something real myself. And so therefore, I don't really feel attached to the idea that there must be some place in between the gone over and the not gone over where the current going is taking place. So for me, I just read the first verse and I feel like, oh, that's the argument. But then there's a whole chapter after that. And the chapter like brings in, first of all, even though this argument does like work on the law of the excluded middle, he brings in the possibility that you can posit three things, three times. There's past, present, future, and so the three places, going over the, you know, and so you consider as well. Suppose there is a being gone over. Let's set aside, you know, that argument. A guy likes to say there's a being gone over. Then he argues, oh, well, you have a goer, a being gone over, and a going, and none of them exist in an analytically locatable way as having their own nature. Because they all exist, they all prop each other up, just like long and short. And essentially, in the short version, which is what we're doing now, that's the whole rest of the chapter. He takes all these different ways of thinking about going in the three times and who's going and where they're going, and shows how none of them can exist in and themselves, and that they only are propping each other up, like moment by moment, in order to be positive. Okay. Okay, so then we go to change. If you turn in the big handout to page 56, we also already talked about this, but I just thought there was something so beautiful in here, I didn't want to pass over it. No, we're not going to go through the whole argument, but basically this very much related to what we were just talking about. I asked this question the other day, do things change? And if things change, that means the thing must change, because the thing is one of the things. And so if a thing changes, then like is it still there after it changed, or is it not still there? And if it's not still there, how can you say that there's a changed thing? And I don't know, this actually, with the example of the nanosecond, this holds a lot of force for me personally. I think about, one way I think about impermanence is to help you to remind that because there's no intrinsically, things would be permanent if they had some intrinsic nature that locked them into being really the way they are. They couldn't change. And therefore, you can say the flame, must be permanent because it inherently exists, and posit that to yourself. And you stupid guy, you will have to accept that the flame is permanent because you grasp it as some real objective thing, And so, what I'm saying? You can give these arguments to yourself based on, it's like, oh, I don't really think that it's permanent. But wouldn't that be implied if it existed in and of itself? So you can use impermanence that way, right? Right. But the other way to think about it is that when we believe in impermanence, I think that we have a sense of that, that basically we think things are, I mean us, not everybody in the world, but us in the room. We think things are impermanent, and we already remember maybe that doesn't just mean that we're going to die or that, we'll be leaving the center later or something like that, but it means that things are changing moment by moment. So Venerable Chödrön's got it down to nanosecond by nanosecond now for us. And so we're down to that point, the nanosecond level of impermanence, right? And of course the problem is you never come to the bottom of it, just like the other thing. It just keeps going, and it's it's I teach my students all the time that things are momentary, but I don't even believe in these moments for a second, and I have to pretend that I do to explain momentary impermanence to them. I just think, this is so silly, Fortunately, I'll get to explain that it's wrong later on. Yeah. Right, because, there's these can be infinitely broken down into their parts, and the idea if there was some real, nanosecond that persisted from the beginning to the end of the nanosecond, right, then it wouldn't work. So on page 56, they go through how Nagarjuna uses this argument against Vaisheshika's, but then he points out that this same argument could also be applied to Buddhist notions of impermanence, which is, of course, the context that we were thinking about it. And then he says there at the bottom that, as Dalai Lama said when lecturing on this text in 1972, everything is always new, right, in the next moment. Because that relates to this idea that I was saying, well, things can't change. I'm not becoming a Platonist. It's just that there's no real thing that can persist to the next moment as the same thing that was there before, but now different, See what I'm saying? We talk about continuums, but they're just posited in relationship to moments, and these moments themselves are completely unfindable, right? So that's why the Dalai Lama says when things are always new. I like the fact that he says they're always new. It's not in each moment, see? He didn't say in each moment they're new. Before you can count the next moment, in between now and the next moment, they're already new. It's I don't really have a way to think about that. I understand the idea, but so you can think about how water flows or something like that, and it's not thinking of it as, but shh, you know what I'm saying? I don't know. Yeah.
See the sea and the ocean, the waves
go back.
And
Constantly changing.
Constantly changing.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
are the same thing.
Looking and watching a river, I guess is the way. It's try to catch a moment and say, oh, there's that moment and the next moment, but it's it's changing faster than you can see. Yeah.
Same as the cognitive numbers.
Oh yeah.
It's three.
Mm-mm.
It's always
There's irrational numbers. There's infinite number of numbers between every two numbers that you can name. Right. Yeah, it is like that. That's what it's like. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Okay, so, and now we come to the person. Let's see. So we start on page 58. We're not going to go all through all the reasonings, but I just want to some things, starting at the bottom of page 57. One of the things I think he mentioned is that Nagarjuna has two ways of reasoning that the person is empty of self, one in analyzing in terms of 6 constituents and the other in terms of the 5 aggregates. But Jeffrey has nicely noticed that in both cases, immediately after finding the person doesn't exist in terms of these subunits, then Nagarjuna shows that neither these subunits are locatable either, and that they also, have no existence in and of themselves. And then over on page 58, he says Nagarjuna refutes the self through the 5-fold analysis. The aggregates are not the self, and they are not in it. It is not in them, and without them it is not. It is not mixed with the aggregates like fire and fuel. Therefore, how could the self exist? That's 82 in the precious, verse 82 in the precious garland. And then Jeffrey points out that Jeffrey says that this mirrors, using the word mirror, this mirrors the first stanza of chapter 22 on the Treatise of the Middle Way about the Tathagata, which we already read on page 441 of Ocean. And when I read this, I thought, well, it doesn't exactly mirror it. I wouldn't call that a mirroring. The more I looked at it, it's okay. So there's 5 points in each one, and the first point that's mentioned in each argument is the same, but then the order is switched around so that it basically if you write on the first one about the aggregates in the self, and you write like 1 and then 3 on the first line, and then 4 and 2 on the second line, then you'll see that that corresponds to the order of the arguments as they're given in the first 2 lines of the treatise. So basically, I guess, I don't know if there is a philosophical purpose or a metric purpose, but the same 4 arguments are given about the person in general and about the Buddha, but they're switched in the order, the first 4 of the 5. And then the 5th argument is in both cases given in the 3rd line, but it certainly appears on the surface a little bit different. It may come down, I think it comes down to being a different way of talking about the same thing. But with the self and the aggregates in the Ratnavali, the precious garland, he says the self is not mixed with the aggregates like fire and fuel. And when I read that, I didn't think that it sounded anything like possession, which is the one that is mentioned in the 3rd line about the Tathagata. And of course, then the 4th lines are, exact mirroring of each other. So then, anyway, you take these 5 arguments, 5 reasonings, 5 places to look to find the person, whether that's just a general person or a Buddha, and then you add to it the self can't be found as the collection of the aggregates, and the self is not the shape of the aggregates, and you get Chandrakirti's 7-fold reasoning. So I'm just picking a few points out of Jeffrey's analysis then in the following pages. If the self is the aggregates, then the self would have to be produced and disintegrate moment by moment, depending on the production and disintegration of the aggregates. The self would be like something that is constantly changing and fluctuating. The inherently existent self that we're grasping onto doesn't have that, aspect, quality of fluctuation. And also then on page 59, if the aggregates, Chandrakirti says, if the aggregates were the self, that if they were identical to the self, if they were the self, then they have to have the same characteristics and properties of the self, and that wouldn't just include momentariness, but it would include plurality. Like the aggregates, no matter how you talk about them, they're all already multiple. So you can't say, I have a self. You have to have a self for every part of you that you want to designate, right? Because there's I don't think anybody, really thinks that their mind and body have no parts, right? But, so then you really can't have a unitary self, and that sense of like self as existing in and of itself has to be fragmented into parts. It can't be self-existent because it can't be one thing. Because it's already one with the aggregates, and there are many things, right? It's already fragmented in order to be one with the things that you're claiming it's one with. And then the fifth Dalai Lama's sacred word of Manjushri, which Jeffrey translated a long time ago. I don't know whether, I hope that's still available to people somewhere. Is, he says in the middle of that page, if I were one with the body, it would be it would in no way be sensible for me to say my body, because I was already the body. It would be, and likewise, would you say the body's body or my I? You would have these problems. And also, and then Nagarjuna has this argument that in the below, that if the aggregates are identical to the self, then why do you even talk about a self? It's like redundant. You already have the aggregate. It's the same thing as the self. What additional meaning is added by having this thing? And then we gave the argument the other day that if the the self, if we think of the self, the person as taking up the aggregates from lifetime to lifetime, that becomes unintelligible. If the person nominally existent and this person is exactly the same as the aggregates, then the agent of the way of taking up and the object taken up become identical, and then swords can cut themselves and so forth like that. So skipping over to page 61, the idea that if the self were other than the aggregates, we addressed this the other day, like I'm always imagining myself going into cows and to different planets and so forth, while I remain here perfectly the same in terms of my mind and body, both my mind and body. It's not just that I'm physically here appearing to talk to you. All of my aggregates are here present, but since myself is an essentially different character, it can go hither and yon, sending it off in different places. And then, so the inherently different must be unrelated, the Dalai Lama says. And so there's actually quite a lot of discussion about this if you're interested in, I don't know how the page is marked, but it's in the analysis of the person in the Great Treatise. Because there's a lot of question about, like, could you have like an inherent things that are in the same continuum that are nonetheless inherently different, and like the self and the aggregates being in the same continuum, and then people are thinking like, well, going from one lifetime to a next lifetime, and it's like, and somebody said, well, that would. Then the argument is given, well, no, if they're inherently different, then it could be just like two different people who are here right now are the kind of difference that they're thinking of, like me and the horse or something like that. So doesn't. Then the third position is over on page 62. The third and fourth positions, that the self is in the aggregates and the aggregates are in the self. So I was trying to think about this, like I always never really liked this example about the forest of trees and the snow very much. The aggregates, this has come from Buddhapalita. The aggregates do not exist in the Tathagata like a forest of trees in the snow. I always had a hard time picturing it. It's like, but anyway, we're supposed to understand that the Tathagata, or the person, is this snowy field. And then the aggregates are existing in the person like a forest of trees, like in the snowy field, right? I started thinking of it as like, it's a little easier, like thinking of a field, like a big open field, just right, and then there's like 5 moose out there in the field. It's like, it seems like, then, I can understand when it's something like that. But I don't know why, it just appears better to my mind to think of it that way. And and then you can switch it around and say, like, the person doesn't exist in the aggregates like a lion in the forest. So, the forest, again, represents the aggregates, but now the person, instead of being this big snowy base up for the field, is like the lion, that's moving around inside the forest. Jeffrey in the Emptiness Yoga, he says, well, instead of a lion in the forest, we could think about it as a marble in a bag of meat. It's the same idea, right? Except it's going to get a little bit more vividly related to we're talking about this, you know. Yeah. Right. So in either of these cases, if the self is in the aggregates or aggregates are in the self, it comes down to all of these different 7 things or 5 things collapse, of course, in some way back to same or different. And then the arguments used are basically the same. So these both of the third and fourth possibilities are understood to come down to being different in either case. If A is in B, then you can't say A and B are self-identical. And so if they're different, then you have all the same fallacies that are associated with their being different. And I was thinking about this a little bit as like, well, how do what kind of feelings do I have about that? And I thought it's like this idea of a field, and then there's the moose in it, like that the word field I'm picking on purpose because I was thinking maybe myself is like a field, that's around my body, and I'm thinking this is my own, namdok, my own hallucination, right? It's like maybe the field goes out a centimeter from the surface of my skin, so like it includes the space around my hairs that stick out from my arm and so forth. But it doesn't like go farther than that. That's my self field, and that my mind and body are the things that are safely able to, like rabbits, hopping around in the self, that field. Like that. Anyway, I think it's worth thinking about this. Like, how do we? I mean, you have to play with this. It's like this is what Jeffrey taught us always to do. Is like actually think about like how are we feeling that we exist, right? And then mix that back and forth between what the treatises say. So the fifth position that he uses here, the one from Ratnavali, the self and the aggregates from the Precious Garland, is the self does not possess the aggregates. Tathagata, or a self, does not possess the aggregates in a way that a tree possesses its core. So unlike the third and fourth one, which all come down to the prong of difference, the fifth one of possession is understood as being subdivided, that you can understand, this is the way they always explain it, that you can understand possession in 2 different ways. That there can be possession in the sense of something possessing something that's a different entity from it, like Devadatta and his ox. I don't know whether Devadatta really had an ox, but somebody, a person and their ox, right? And then versus you say a person and their body, or something like, or person in their ears, or person in their body. So you're thinking like there's one sense in which you have something that's also part of who you are. Let's just not philosophical language, but how we feel about it. It's like there's something that's part of who we are, something that's one entity with us, and then there's something that's a different entity from us, and we can use the sense of possession or having in both of those senses, right? So that's the way the argument works. So they have to use essentially, fundamentally, the same reasonings that we already went through to refute the self being the same or self being different as for possession. But you have to use both sets of reasoning in possession by first subdividing possession into possession in the sense of possessing something that's different, and then you use the different reasonings, or possession in the sense of having something that's one entity with you, like my sternum, and then that's a different kind of having, and you use the reasonings for oneness associated with that. Okay. So, what I wanted to do now is sort of read a couple passages from Emptiness Yoga and sort of moving towards a conclusion. We were reading this passage the other day, and it says, when you analyze in this way, you're much more engaged than you ever were before in your life. And it's said that one who knows emptiness is aware. And then Jeffrey glosses that by more perceptive, more awake, and more conscientious. And I was like, I didn't remember reading that or where or what it meant or where I... and then he explains that, when you're analyzing, you don't get to emptiness by sort of going away from things and turning your mind to emptiness. You only get to emptiness by going more and more deeply into things, to attending to them more and more closely. This conscientious or aware, is like all this sort of focus of looking more deeply into things, not away from them, in order to find emptiness, right? And so anyway, I didn't know where that quote was from, and just it happened that I found it almost immediately as soon as I looked. That this is in volume 3, page 319 of the great treatise where Tsongkhapa quotes the questions of the Naga king Anavatapta Sutra, which seems to be frequently, along with the Samadhi Raja King of Concentration Sutra, it seems to be a pretty important sutra for a Gelugpa interpretation of things. And so, yeah, it's like this idea is presented right there in Sutra. Let me just look at that. We'll just read the context of that for a second. Whatever is produced from conditions is not produced. It is not intrinsically produced. Whatever depends on conditions, I consider empty. And one who knows emptiness is diligent. Now, this word diligent is the same word that Jeffrey translated aware. It's pakyur in Tibetan, and it covers the sort of range. He says more perceptive, more aware, more conscientious. So I was trying to think of like how to say in English, like how that word can sort of cover the range between more aware and more conscientious or diligent. And it's like this idea of being more tuned in. Like if you're more tuned in than you're to what's going, and that's what he's saying here in this passage. Going more deeply into things, paying closer attention. If you're more tuned in, then you see what's really going on and what you need to do. And so that implies that you're more conscientious, more diligent, because you're more tuned in to what's actually needed in the situation, right? It's like interesting. It's sort of like sort of suggesting that conscientiousness is not a matter of ignoring the world and paying attention to the rules, but it's like paying attention to the world. It's when you really are paying attention to the rules, right? Paying attention to the world, then you can see how these rules guide us, in being most helpful in responding to the situation. And anyway, I just thought that was something definitely very interesting that I should re-bring to your attention. And then in terms of that tuning in and like putting more pressure, analytical pressure on things instead of, not turning your mind away from them towards some space like emptiness, but thinking about, for us it's about it, we have to think about it. First you read this book, then you have to think, what does it say? How does that relate to me? What does it mean, right? And then think about it some more. You can think about it while you're sitting on a cushion or not. Do you know what I'm saying? You have to like apply it and sort of think about what does this mean? How do I feel that I exist? And this is page 340 to 341 in Introduction to Emptiness. In Emptiness Yoga. It said, when people see a dependent arising, I'm slightly rewording what Jeffrey wrote. When we see a dependent arising, we usually tacitly assent to the way it appears and take it as inherently existing. And we feel this way because we know that some things that we see are being produced from a cause. We didn't make them up. They're real because they came about through being really produced. For instance, when we say, your child's really growing up fast, or the corn is growing, or the flowers are growing. If we're not satisfied with these as mere nominalities, and we search to see if there's something really in there in itself, something that we could point at, then we're looking for a real object, right, that would exist in or among the basis of imputation. And the world says, when you do this, if you talk to the people about this, then they're like, stop, please. Jeffrey must have had this experience. I can imagine, since kindergarten or before. I can imagine his kindergarten teacher, when he's questioning her about the dozen, He's like, what do you mean you can't find the dozen? Right? So he's had a lot of experience with people getting irritated with this. And he said, the world says, and starting with my kindergarten teacher, the world says that we should just accept that these are findable phenomena without challenge. And people will get angry if we start poking around too much. I love that. They claim that when we say the corn is growing, we do not in any way intend to enter into any analysis about what this really means. That's the whole point. We accept the appearance of concrete objects non-analytically, and of course the idea is in this system is that appearance is false, even at the sensory level. It's not just that we have some conceptual overlay. We're going along with a deceptive appearance, even at the level of our eyes and so forth. I have had not like the Jeffrey and the kindergarten teacher, but I have had experiences somewhat like this, where people tell me to stop talking, and and not even about emptiness. Some people don't want analysis of anything. It's like you go to a movie and then you come out and you say, and then the person says, no, we're not going there. We saw a movie. Let's see what appears next. let's not go into it. Yeah. But, this is what Jeffrey says, but are we tied to something destructive by this lack of analysis? Does the lack of analysis bind us to something false? We have to notice our feelings, things being real, when someone says, the corn didn't grow much last week. We don't usually analyze these things, so it's upsetting not just to other people, but to some aspect of ourselves. We're going against the grain of our own feelings when we do this. It feels like it's going against the warp and woof of the reality as we know it. That it's cutting hard against the grain of things. And Jeffrey says, however, opposing what we feel to be reality can't be taken as a sign that this sort of unnatural activity is inappropriate or unhelpful. For example, our minds just naturally run around in circles and don't focus on any particular thing. But people can notice when they calm their minds in meditation and that it's hard but beneficial, right? And in the same way, it's like analysis goes against the grain of our natural feeling that we should just take things as they appear, right? But nonetheless, he's not trying to say this proves that it has benefit, but we should suspect that even if it doesn't come naturally to think deeply about these things, that it may be truly helpful in the end. I really like that passage. That's 340 and 341 in Emptiness Yoga. So, there's this little quote from George Eliot that I came across where it says, what's the point of life if it's not to make life less difficult for others? And I thought it was really nice because it's like there's a real sense of like if we're not engaged with helping and serving others, then everything ends up being hollow and empty in the bad way, Sopa. Like that there's like that it's not there's no sense in it. It's just like, okay, we went to the movie, now let's get some ice cream, and it's like what? And His Holiness talks about this like very eloquently, this, and say, well, what's the point of just having this and that sensation or this or that luxury? We need a fifth car for gosh sake. Let's build a second garage to put it in and so forth. And then, oh, he talks one thing, it's like, well, we have enough cars, let's get a boat. Like, what is the point when other people on the planet are suffering so much, and then, just to be, so George Eliot has, an insight along this line, not from studying Buddhism, but from being a human being and paying attention. It's like, it just seems shallow and pointless and superficial to be chasing from sensation to sensation, and when you find this sense of fulfillment and helping others who are suffering so much, right? And in that regard, I personally have a conviction that is that an innate delusion about how things exist is a root of enormous needless misery in our world. And I'm saying I feel this, and that I think that it has to do, you can see how that of course people have disagreements about this or that resource or this or that way of doing things, but which is, people are coming from different points of view. But when they have this delusion of like, I'm real and my way of doing it is right, and by the way, I heard this from my teacher, and so, you may not yet be considered spawn of Satan, but if you keep on like that, you will be in that category of a person who is just naturally wrong from their own side because they're interfering with this, right, not just, more helpful or, preferable in this instance, or the way I'm used to doing it. That's actually a lot of times what it comes down to, right? Way of doing things. And so then people are like, not just like disagreeing, but killing. And that being the case, and it also being the case that we find meaning and purpose in life by helping others, and putting that together with this root of so much misery for others is this wrong way of seeing things that we ourselves are in the grip of. It seems that it's very important for us to be involved in putting pressure on things analytically, and not just taking the appearances that we're naturally heir to. When you say they're innately, I mean it's what comes naturally to us to be like. And it, it's like natural for us to go on and have a big war against the people that we see as naturally evil because they're, intrinsically doing the wrong thing. So I feel that maybe we could think that the cyclic existence, like as a vast burning prison house, but on the other hand, this is also, this prison that we're in is like a bubble in a sea of profound natural peace, and that the walls of the bubble, the walls of the prison, the afflictions, they're held in place by this powerful innate delusion that exaggerates how things are and cuts us off from other people and seeing them as distant and unconnected. And it's like surface tension in a sense, that the force is like very strong, but unable to bear up under sustained pressure. It's like you put a little pressure on it, right? Or just like give it a good whack, it gives a good whack back. But if you like press and keep pressing, right? It's like it's false on the inside. It's internally contradictory. It begins to show the strain. You begin to have some questions. It's not that you suddenly all makes sense, but you begin to get like, gosh, things really inherently exist, but there's some problem. You know what I'm saying? There's some problem, and I haven't quite worked out how that could be yet. It's like you get a doubt tending toward the wrong idea, and then a little bit keep putting pressure, right, in that direction. And I think that, then that's the way that we can be of greatest benefit to others. And the Samadhi Raja Sutra said, which I has said was I don't know, I was thinking about my thesis that this is the root text for the insight section, and I might want to say that it is a root text for the insight section. But anyway, it's a key text that many of the ideas for Lamrim Chema, which is the foundational work for this whole system, comes from, come out of playing out the full implications of just these 4 lines. And it's this: if you analytically determine the lack of self in things, and then cultivate just that in meditation, then you will attain the peace of nirvana. And you will not attain peace through any other means. So it starts with putting this analytical pressure on things. It starts with doing what Jeffrey's describing and going against the grain of your own intuitions and going against the grain of what people would prefer to have you doing. And asking these irritating questions, about how things could really be the way we take them for granted to be. And then getting some sort of insight into how, when I search to find that core of how I thought things were, I come up with this space instead of a handle on the inside, that I can know what things really are, and then that becomes the basis of cultivation and meditation and leads to a non-dualistic experience that has content. It has wisdom, as I was saying, is like non-dual wisdom is not just non-dual. It's also wisdom. Where do we get the content? It has to come from the correct content for that non-dual understanding. Has to be some understanding that we initially arrive at with the kind of tools that we have to work with now. This analytical insight. Okay. Well, that's what I had to say. I finished. I finished 6 minutes early instead of 4 minutes late. Yeah. Okay, so that means somebody can ask a question now. Yes?
How does this play with
The Samadhi Raja Sutra quote? No, with what?
It's just a different way of looking at going back to the primal Buddha.
Oh, I see. I don't know. I think it's like, obviously the idea of emptiness is primordial, that is in what we went over today, right? And so you can speak of the idea of awakening then also, as that since there's always been this reality and there's always been beings with minds, then I would say that there's always been beings who have come to awakening, right? But if we speak about a particular person, right, then the way His Holiness has spoken about it is that, like, well, when you think about the Buddha, then you think about that the Buddha was once a person like us who came to be awakened through certain causes and conditions, right? So I don't know. I guess I was saying if we're going to posit a primordial Buddha within this system that's always been Buddha, it's sort of like saying that there's a principle of awakening. There's always been awakening, right? And we can say Buddha is, we can personify this idea of there always being something to be awakened to, the fundamental nature things, and there always being minds to awake to it, and personify that as a Buddha. There has always been this awakening. There has always been people who have awakened. right? But just for me personally, I like the idea that every awakened being was once like me. It's more hopeful for me. Yeah. Yes, John.
What are the complications that are there from following dependent arising relativity?
Well, there's a lot of things I could say about this. One is that I think we have to be a little bit careful when we go from. Well, Bob is doing a certain thing, right? It's a skill and means to try to like get people to hear something, right? That otherwise just might be sound like birds talking or something. Do you know what I'm saying? So sometimes people pick up one of Jeffrey's texts and they'll say, well, there's a lot of odd phrases in here. Yeah. And then Bob is like trying to avoid that by using phrases that will sound right to people. But then eventually over time, they'll start to see that they're pointing to something that was different from what they thought before. So that's what I would credit, Bob for doing. He's trying to make an easier point of entry for people. And he's intentionally, and it's not just that, but it's intentionally playing off the idea that people are used to the idea of relativity. Not just relative in general, but relativity, calling dependent arising relativity, and he's sort of implicitly making a comparison between theory of relativity in physics and dependent arising. And personally, I just really, in terms of going beyond the skill and means of making an entry point, I think it's good at, when you're past that, to be a little careful about like too quickly mapping things like that. That's what's called the matching terms. Like when in the history of Buddhism did, the history of this history of Buddhism since Shakyamuni, did Buddhism go to a country that was already too smart for its britches, or a world? When it went to Tibet, people didn't have writing, and they thought, oh, we should get some writing so we can like have these books. And when it went to Sri Lanka, people thought, oh, we should get some writing too, so we can have these books. It's not like you had religion, you had tradition, you had culture, but you didn't have like literature and philosophy and people who had deeply thought and written about and analyzed things, as opposed to the folk traditions. So there's two main same thing with Japan, essentially, really. So with the times when Buddhism has come to a place where people already thought they knew what for and what of, in a full-blown way, were Buddhism going to China and Buddhism coming to the West. And these are the parallel cases. Okay, so when Buddhism came to China, it was necessarily all these crazy barbarians worship Buddha bones that are put in some kind of building, and I'm sure couldn't be anything important involved in that. We'll just ignore it. And then through centuries of different causes and conditions coming together, then Buddhism turned out to get a foothold and to really be understood by the Chinese over a period of time. And so I'm just saying, you can say, oh, that's the model for somewhat like where we are. Well, one of the phases that Buddhism went through as it was in the process of becoming Chinese, or that Chinese were in the process of becoming Buddhists, which was both, was that matching terms. Like people had all these, they already had philosophical terms. They already had a list of virtues. They didn't need Buddhist list of virtues. They already had a list of virtues. They already had, categories for talking about what kinds of things exist. So when Buddhists came in with all these categories, it was impossible for them not to try to make sense of it by matching them up to the categories that they already had. And this has advantages and disadvantages. And that's what I'm trying to say. It's like, on the one hand, if you sort of can't, you have to learn something new from starting from what you know. You can't just like say, oh, forget everything you know and now let's start. It's like everybody starts from somewhere. And if where you're starting from has a sophisticated philosophy, then you inevitably look at the new philosophy through the eyes of where you're coming from, okay, to some extent. You could try to bracket it out, but to some extent it happens anyway, right? But when you do that, of course, you have certain kinds of distortions that come in, and you don't really get into the way that philosophy should be properly understood. You're creating a hybrid, a hybridity, as they say, a hybrid between what was there before and what was in the tradition. My view is that we're all hybrids right here. We are hybrids, whether we may have different ways of thinking about it than that, but it's sort of inevitable. And the question is, like, what is the core that we want to locate and understand and preserve in the Dharma? We can't become Tibetan. You can even ask a question about, like, what does it mean to be a Gelugpa? Jeffrey has said that he's not a Gelugpa, right? And I mean, obviously, so that's a question. It's like, is that a specific? You can investigate what's really the thing to be preserved. And the problem then with is the same. It's the pros and cons. I mean, when Bob does some of these things, it creates certain misunderstanding. At the same time, it creates a certain understanding. And Jeffrey's texts have a lot more surface resistance, but then they're very true, and because they're harder at the front and they're not welcoming, they're showing you this is something different. Don't think you already know this right up front, right? Whereas Bob's like lure people, you could say in a skillful way, right, into thinking that this is something that they'll understand, and then gradually it turns out to be a little bit different than what they thought, or maybe way different what they could imagine, right? So I get, now that's one thing, and then the other part in this case specific, because you could give a lot of examples of Bob's translations if with that, but in this particular case, I worry about when people think about relativity and they're not thinking deeply, that we think in terms of inherently existent dependent origination in our way, or that everything's part of Gaia, but then it doesn't actually like deconstruct there's no deconstruction mode. There's just a connection mode.
I don't agree with that, though.
Okay.
I think the problem is that people think they know what relativity is, but unless you study physics, you don't. You just have a word,
Right.
and they go, oh, that's that physics word, But but to me, having studied physics, I think it's the proper word.
Okay, that's possible. Yeah. I don't preclude that. I don't necessarily agree or disagree. I just say that that's the problem, is that you could say, well, the problem is that people don't understand relativity then, and you're using
Well, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but I'm saying that
if you understand it correctly, it's a good fit.
it works for me.
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
I study physics, but
Yeah.
I know a lot of things that Bob says, people think they know what he's talking about, and you don't. Just like
Right.
you said, just exactly as you said. And he's talking about something different, and they're just using their advertised speech to understand what he's trying to say. And it's, a lot of times it's funny, so.
Oh, it's very funny.
Yeah.
He's the funniest. Absolutely. Yeah.
No, I agree with what you're saying, but I think by our, by how we, our natural, as you say, our natural way of being. I mean, I really like to discuss this idea, because our natural way of being is we can take so much of this. Well, it's not this, and it's not that, and it's not this and that, and then you just kind of like get full of that, and you go, okay, so what is it? How does this have anything to do with anything except sitting around and philosophizing? So we always have to bring it back to how we act and how we think is sits on top of this potential misunderstanding, and we're all
I see.
trying to, Nagarjuna and everybody, all been trying to pierce that
Yeah.
every possible way we can.
Yeah.
And we all have to take our if whatever, sitting here with you doesn't make me more wise and more compassionate, then I wasted my time, in the end.
Yeah, I can't disagree with anything you said. Yes.
I would just comment of it. I think the problem with relativity is that they're confusing what, as John would say, there's existential dependence versus notional dependence. Most people, as far as long and short, that's a notional dependence. Top, bottom, left, right, or in the blue buzz, where they differentiate in a hierarchy of three understandings of dependence. There's causal, neurological, and then conceptual, that is the basis of designation, the mind that makes that designation, and the term itself. And I think that my problem as far as saying it's relativity is that you're focusing strictly on that notional or conceptual dependence versus there's a more general or a broader way to look at it.
Well, but just for the sake of other people, mereological means having to do with relationship parts and wholes. So that was the correct explanation of the three types of. But just my reaction to what you said is, I think when you say to most people relativity, they're not going to think that you're saying anything about this things being dependently imputed. That would be, except for Tanya and then other people who like maybe other people will not generally think about that. They'll think that most people will think about, things have conditional, complicated sets of conditional relationships. Don't exist,
My understanding is that most people would say relativity is something is only defined by the same as nothing.
Oh.
Like long and short or top bottom.
Maybe. Yeah. Maybe I don't know what most people think. I don't know, honestly. Maybe I shouldn't say. I guess I just, I'm in between, it's like I feel the appeal of what Bob is doing, but then I'm also have this hermeneutic of, when I read Jeffrey, I think he's being so literal that I wonder whether, this makes things unnecessarily difficult for people sometimes. And then when I read Bob, I think, I wonder if he's like sacrificed some precision in order to make this seem more appealing to people. And then I always try to find myself seeing if I can find some way in between. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and being such good listeners. That's very valuable to me. Yeah.